The year 2026 does not arrive with a dramatic collapse, but with something far quieter and more unsettling: the presence of cooling embers in the spiritual life of humanity. We are living in a post-digital society where connection has reached unprecedented levels, yet desire, especially spiritual desire, has noticeably diminished. People can communicate instantly across continents, access limitless knowledge within seconds, and remain constantly engaged with streams of content. And yet, beneath this hyperconnectivity lies a growing absence of hunger, a quiet erosion of the soul's capacity to long deeply for what is eternal. Within this environment, faith itself has undergone a subtle but profound transformation. It has been optimized, streamlined to fit the demands of speed, convenience, and efficiency. Spiritual engagement can now be compressed into short segments: a sermon listened to in transit, a worship experience accessed through a screen, a devotional thought consumed between tasks. While these adaptations increase accessibility, they also risk stripping faith of its essential nature. Historically, faith has required waiting, sacrifice, discipline, and surrender. It has demanded something costly. But when faith becomes easy to access and effortless to maintain, it begins to lose its transformative power. Without cost, there is rarely true change. As a result, spiritual sensitivity begins to decline. When the mind is constantly saturated with content, even content that is positive or faith-based, it loses the ability to discern, to listen, and to respond. The inner life becomes dull. People may hear about God daily, yet rarely encounter Him in a way that disrupts or reorders their lives. They can articulate theological ideas, but no longer feel the weight of conviction. The embers are still present, but they no longer burn with intensity. To fully understand this condition, it is necessary to compare it with a radically different era: the early 19th century, during the period commonly associated with widespread spiritual awakening. In that time, the pursuit of God was not a matter of preference, it was a matter of necessity. Society was marked by instability and uncertainty, expanding frontiers, social fragmentation, economic hardship, and the lingering effects of conflict. Structures that might have provided security were either fragile or non-existent. In such an environment, people were forced to confront their limitations and vulnerabilities. This collective instability created fertile ground for spiritual hunger. Faith was not an accessory to life, it was its foundation. People sought God not because it was convenient, but because they recognized that nothing else could sustain them. Their desperation became an opening. Their uncertainty became a catalyst. Spiritual gatherings were intense, prolonged, and deeply participatory. Prayer was not casual, it was urgent. Repentance was not abstract, it was immediate and visible. Transformation was not gradual, it was often radical. In contrast, the 21st century, and particularly the world of 2026, presents an entirely different dynamic. Technology has not only reshaped communication, but has also replaced many forms of direct spiritual experience with mediated alternatives. Presence is substituted with representation. Silence is replaced by noise. Stillness is avoided. Faith, once central, is now often positioned as one element within a broader lifestyle, something that can be integrated, adjusted, or deprioritized depending on individual preference. At the same time, the fragmentation of attention has become one of the defining characteristics of modern life. The ability to focus deeply for extended periods has eroded. Without sustained attention, depth becomes nearly impossible. And without depth, spiritual awakening cannot take root. Revival requires not just exposure to truth, but immersion in it. It requires time, repetition, and internalization, conditions that are increasingly rare. From this contrast, a central thesis emerges with clarity. The spiritual coldness of the present age is not the result of a lack of information, but the lack of inward surrender. Never before have people had such extensive access to theological resources, teachings, and spiritual content. And yet, the willingness to yield, to submit, and to be transformed has diminished. Knowledge has increased, pananagudiyansa has decreased. Awareness has expanded, but surrender has contracted. This reality becomes even more apparent when examining what can be described as Linda's convenient Christianity. This form of faith is shaped to align with the rhythms and expectations of modern life. It does not require a restructuring of priorities or a reordering of values. It allows individuals to participate without fundamentally changing. The emphasis shifts from long-term formation to short-term emotional experience. Spiritual engagement becomes episodic rather than continuous, defined by moments rather than sustained commitment. One of the primary reasons this model fails to produce lasting cultural transformation is its lack of practical theological depth. There is a widening gap between what is heard and what is lived. Teachings accumulate, but practices remain shallow. Disciplines such as sustained prayer, intentional repentance, and sacrificial living are either minimized or neglected altogether. Without these practices, faith remains conceptual rather than embodied, and what is not embodied cannot transform. In addition, the rise of radical individualism has further weakened the communal dimension of faith. Christianity, historically rooted in covenant community, becomes increasingly privatized. Individuals interpret, apply, and modify belief systems independently, often without accountability or shared responsibility. Without communal reinforcement, convictions become flexible. Without collective commitment, transformation becomes inconsistent. Overlaying these dynamics is the powerful influence of consumer culture, which has subtly but significantly reshaped the structure of the modern church. Believers begin to function as consumers, evaluating their spiritual environments based on personal satisfaction. Churches, in turn, may adapt by prioritizing engagement, accessibility, and experience delivery. While not inherently problematic, this shift introduces a critical distortion. Value becomes tied to preference rather than transformation. When faith is framed as a product, it is inevitably constrained by the expectations of the consumer, efficient, comfortable, and non-disruptive. Against this backdrop, the revival that occurred at Asbury in 2023 stands as a striking counterexample. It was not strategically engineered, was it driven by elaborate programming. It emerged organically, extending over multiple days without interruption. The focus was not performance, but presence. There was no emphasis on spectacle, only on repentance, prayer, and continuous worship. What distinguished this event was not merely its duration, but its depth. Participants were not passive observers. They were active responders. The impact of this movement extended beyond emotional intensity. It penetrated individual lives, producing genuine transformation that then spread outward in an unforced manner. This pattern contrasts sharply with many contemporary approaches that attempt to replicate revival through structure, branding, or methodology. What happened at Asbury could not be manufactured because it did not originate from external design. It emerged from internal readiness. This leads to a critical conclusion. Revival cannot be produced. It can only be conceived and carried. It is not the result of strategic execution, but of spiritual formation. It requires conditions that cannot be artificially created. Humility, desperation, surrender, and a willingness to pay a cost. Where these conditions are absent, revival remains elusive. Where they are present, even in small measure, the possibility of awakening begins to reappear. Ultimately, the issue is not whether the embers still exist. They do. The question is whether there are hearts willing to become altars once again. Places where those embers can be fanned into flame. Building on the recognition that modern spiritual boldness is rooted not in a lack of access, but in a deficit of surrendering. The discussion now turns to a more probing and uncomfortable question. Is the indifference we observe today a conscious choice, or is it the inevitable outcome of a deeper systemic erosion? Framing the issue this way forces a shift from surface-level critique to structural and relational analysis. It is no longer sufficient to describe what is happening. We must interrogate why it is happening and whether responsibility lies primarily within individuals or within the environments that have shaped them. On one level, spiritual indifference can clearly be interpreted as a choice. In a culture saturated with options, individuals consistently make decisions about how to allocate their attention, energy, and desire. The prioritization of comfort over consecration is rarely accidental. It reflects a hierarchy of values in which convenience is elevated above holiness. Practices that demand stillness, self-denial, or sustained engagement are often displaced by those that offer immediate gratification or minimal disruption. In this sense, indifference is not merely a passive condition, it is an active preference. People do not simply drift away from death, they choose, repeatedly and often unconsciously, what will replace it. Closely tied to this is the avoidance of the altar, not in its physical form, but in its theological function. The altar represents a place of surrender, exposure, and transformation. It is where control is relinquished, mga ko, where self is confronted, and where costly decisions are made. To approach the altar is to accept that something must die in order for something else to live. In a cultural environment that emphasizes self-preservation, autonomy, and optimization, such a confrontation becomes deeply undesirable. As a result, many construct forms of faith that allow them to remain spiritually adjacent without ever becoming spiritually vulnerable. The altar is acknowledged conceptually, but bypassed practically. However, to attribute spiritual indifference solely to personal choice would be an incomplete and ultimately insufficient explanation. There is a second dimension that must be considered: indifference as a consequence. Over time, entire systems, educational, ecclesial, and cultural, have contributed to the gradual loss of what might be called a spiritual vocabulary. This vocabulary is not limited to language, but includes categories of understanding, patterns of practice, and expectations of experience. Concepts such as surrender, Repentance and sacrifice are not merely underemphasized. In many contexts, they are no longer meaningfully defined. When individuals are not formed within a framework that teaches them how to yield, how to grieve over sin, or how to persist in disciplined practice, their inability to engage deeply is not surprising. It is learned, or more precisely, it is the result of not having been taught what depth requires. Without models, without instruction, and without environments that normalize these processes, the path toward genuine transformation becomes obscured. What appears as apathy may, in part, be disorientation. This leads to a deeper diagnostic insight. The loss of connection to the altar results in the loss of an awareness of sin. The altar, historically and theologically, is the place where the reality of sin is neither minimized nor abstracted. It is where the cost of separation is recognized and where reconciliation is sought through surrender. When the altar disappears from the functional life of faith, sin does not disappear, but the consciousness of it does. Without that awareness, repentance becomes unnecessary, and without repentance, transformation becomes impossible. The sequence is both subtle and profound. First, the altar is neglected. Then, the language of surrender fades. Next, the sense of conviction diminishes. Finally, the need for repentance is replaced by the maintenance of comfort. What remains is a form of faith that is structurally intact but spiritually hollow, capable of expression but not of renewal. The most accurate conclusion, therefore, is not to choose between choice and consequence, but to recognize their interaction. Spiritual indifference is both a personal decision and the product of a prolonged misalignment with informative systems. Individuals are responsible for their responses, but those responses are shaped within environments that either cultivate or constrain their capacity for depth. To address indifference meaningfully, both dimensions must be confronted. With this framework established, it becomes possible to examine, with greater precision, how genuine spiritual awakening has historically emerged. Rather than treating revival as a mysterious anomaly, it can be analyzed as a convergence of identifiable dynamics. The so-called storm of spiritual fire is not random. It is the result of conditions that, when present simultaneously, generate intensity. The Second Great Awakening provides a particularly instructive case. Its emergence was not the result of a single factor, but of a complex interplay between social crisis, bold leadership, and rigorous spiritual practice. Each of these elements, on its own, is insufficient. Together, they create an environment in which transformation becomes not only possible, but widespread. Social crisis plays a foundational role. Periods of instability disrupt the illusion of self-sufficiency. When economic systems falter, when communities fragment, and when the future becomes uncertain, individuals are confronted with the limits of their control. It is within this disruption that openness can emerge. Desperation, often viewed negatively, becomes a critical threshold. It strips away pretense and exposes need. When all other systems fail to provide meaning or stability, the search for transcendence intensifies. This dynamic can be understood as a progression. Crisis leads to desperation. Desperation creates openness. Openness allows for reception, and reception enables transformation. Without the initial disruption, the subsequent stages rarely occur. Comfort, while desirable, is rarely catalytic. It is the breakdown of comfort that often initiates movement. However, crisis alone does not produce awakening. It must be met with leadership capable of interpreting the moment and directing its energy. During the Second Great Awakening, such leadership often came in unconventional forms. Figures known as circuit riders traversed vast and undeveloped territories, bringing not only messages but presence. Their lives were marked by instability, sacrifice, and endurance. They did not operate within controlled environments, nor were they constrained by rigid institutional frameworks. Instead, they embodied mobility and adaptability, meeting people where they were, geographically, socially, and spiritually. Their significance lies not only in what they preached, but in how they lived. They demonstrated that commitment to spiritual mission could supersede personal comfort and structural security. In doing so, they provided a model of leadership that was both credible and compelling. Their authority was not derived from position, but from demonstrated conviction. Complementing both crisis and leadership were the practices that structured communal experience. The camp meetings of this period represent a particularly important innovation. By removing the constraints of traditional church settings, these gatherings created open environments where participation was not limited by formality or hierarchy. They extended over multiple days, allowing for a sustained saturation of spiritual activity. This duration was critical. Transformation requires time, and these meetings provided it. Moreover, they transformed faith from an individual abstraction into a collective encounter. Participants were not isolated observers. They were part of a shared process. Emotion, conviction, confession, and response were experienced communally, reinforcing both intensity and accountability. The environment itself became formative. Within these gatherings, specific practices emerged that further intensified engagement. One such practice was the use of the anxious bench, a designated space where individuals publicly signaled their internal struggle and desire for change. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a concrete act of exposure. To step forward was to move from private contemplation to public commitment. It introduced a level of accountability that could not be easily reversed. The anxious bench functioned as a bridge between belief and action. It disrupted passivity by requiring movement. It reframed faith from something internal and undefined to something expressed and embodied. In doing so, it reinforced the principle that transformation is not merely experienced, it is enacted. Taken together, these elements, crisis, leadership, communal practice, and embodied response, form the anatomy of a spiritual awakening. They reveal that revival is neither accidental nor mechanical. It emerges when internal readiness intersects with external conditions in a way that compels response. For the present moment, the implications are significant. If indifference is sustained by comfort, fragmentation, and the absence of surrender, then awakening will require the reintroduction of their opposites: disruption, focus, and embodied commitment. It will also require leaders willing to operate beyond conventional constraints and communities willing to create space for depth rather than efficiency. The question then is not whether such a convergence is possible, but whether there are individuals and communities prepared to participate in it. Having examined both the underlying causes of spiritual indifference and the historical anatomy of awakening, the next challenge is not merely diagnostic but integrative. How can the distance between eras be meaningfully bridged? The gap between the intensity of past revivals and the fragmentation of the present is not only temporal, it is methodological, psychological, and deeply practical. To close this gap requires more than admiration of the past. It demands the recovery and reintegration of practices that once sustained spiritual fire, but have since been displaced or forgotten. At the center of this recovery is an honest recognition that certain foundational disciplines have been lost, not in theory, but in lived reality. Extended prayer, for instance, once functioned as a primary mechanism for spiritual formation. It was not uncommon for individuals or communities to remain in prayer for hours, not out of obligation, but out of necessity and hunger. Today, prayer is often compressed into brief, structured moments, sufficient to maintain awareness, but insufficient to produce depth. The difference is not merely quantitative, it is qualitative. Duration allows for saturation, and saturation allows for transformation. Similarly, the practice of corporate repentance has largely disappeared from the center of communal life. In earlier movements, repentance was not confined to private reflection. It was enacted collectively. Communities acknowledged shared brokenness and sought renewal together. This created a culture in which accountability was normalized and transformation was expected. In contrast, modern expressions of faith often isolate repentance to the individual level, if they address it at all. Without a shared acknowledgement of need, the possibility of shared renewal diminishes. Unrestricted worship represents another dimension that has been significantly constrained. Historically, worship was not bound by strict temporal limits. Gatherings extended as long as engagement persisted, allowing space for organic development and deepening response. In contemporary settings, however, worship is frequently structured to fit predefined schedules. While structure provides order, it can also impose ceilings on depth. When time is fixed, experience is often compressed. Opportunity for sustained encounter is reduced. Underlying all of these practices was a level of communal commitment that extended beyond attendance. Participation was not episodic, it was embedded. Individuals saw themselves as part of a collective journey rather than as occasional contributors. This depth of commitment reinforced consistency and created an environment in which spiritual practices could be sustained over time. The question, then, is not simply why these practices have diminished, but how they have been displaced. Their absence is not accidental. It is the result of a gradual migration. Practices that once occupied the center of communal life have been pushed to the margins and, in many cases, replaced entirely by programs and structures designed to achieve efficiency, scalability, and predictability. While these systems are not inherently flawed, they often prioritize manageability over intensity. In doing so, they create environments that are accessible but not transformative. This shift has also produced a corresponding transformation in the psychology of the believer. Faith is no longer primarily experienced as participation, but as observation. Individuals attend, listen, and evaluate, but do not necessarily engage at a level that requires personal investment. The distinction between spectator and participant becomes critical here. A spectator can remain detached, absorbing content without being altered by it. A participant, by contrast, is implicated in the process. Participation requires risk, vulnerability, and commitment. To bridge the gap between eras, this psychological orientation must shift Believers must move from observation to participation, not as an abstract ideal, but as a concrete reorientation of practice. This involves a redefinition of identity. One is no longer a consumer of spiritual experiences, but a contributor to spiritual environments. This shift carries implications not only for individual behavior, but for communal expectations. When participation becomes normative, depth becomes possible. Closely related to this is the transition from consumption to sacrifice. Modern frameworks often position individuals as recipients, seeking experiences that inspire, comfort, or uplift. While these elements have value, they cannot sustain transformation on their own. Sacrifice introduces a different dynamic. It requires the relinquishment of convenience in favor of commitment and the acceptance of cost as a necessary component of growth. Without sacrifice, engagement remains superficial. The contrast between the Asbury revival of 2023 and the present moment illustrates this tension with clarity. Asbury represents what might be described as spontaneous ignition, a sudden and unplanned convergence of readiness and response. It emerged without strategic orchestration and sustained itself through continuous participation. However, ignition alone is not sufficient. Fire that is not maintained will inevitably diminish. By 2026, the challenge has shifted. The question is no longer how to initiate awakening, but how to sustain it. Sustained formation requires discipline. It requires structures, not to control the experience, but to preserve its continuity. The absence of discipline leads to dissipation. What begins as intensity gradually fades into memory if it is not reinforced through consistent practice. Thus, the core issue is not whether fire can be ignited, but whether it can be maintained. This brings the discussion to a central and unavoidable concept: the restoration of the altar. In contemporary terms, the altar must be redefined. It is not a physical object, nor is it confined to a specific location. It is a condition, a space of surrender within the individual and the community. It is where control is relinquished, where identity is confronted, and where transformation becomes possible. To rebuild the altar is to re-establish a place where something is given up in order for something greater to emerge. At its core, the altar represents death to self. This language may appear severe, but it reflects a fundamental principle. Transformation requires relinquishment. As long as the self remains unchallenged and unyielded, change remains superficial. The altar, therefore, is not optional. It is essential. Without it, practices become routines, and routines lose their capacity to transform. Closely linked to the altar is the concept of spiritual desperation. In modern discourse, desperation is often associated with weakness or instability. However, within the context of spiritual awakening, it carries a different meaning. It signifies clarity, the recognition that one's current state is insufficient and that external solutions cannot resolve internal deficits. This awareness creates openness. It breaks down resistance and allows for genuine engagement. Historically, every significant revival has been preceded by such desperation. It is not manufactured, but it can be cultivated through honest reflection and confrontation with reality. When individuals and communities acknowledge their limitations without defensiveness, they create the conditions necessary for renewal. Yet, This process is not without cost. On the individual level, it requires the relinquishment of comfort. Time must be reallocated. Priorities must be reordered. Disciplines must be established and maintained. These are not abstract commitments. They are practical decisions that reshape daily life. Confronting sin, in particular, demands a level of honesty that many prefer to avoid. It disrupts self-perception and requires change. On the collective level, the cost is equally significant. Communities must reevaluate their structures and priorities. Programs that once dominated attention may need to be reduced or reoriented. Space must be created, not for efficiency, but for encounter. This often involves a willingness to relinquish control, allowing processes to unfold without predetermined outcomes. Such a shift can be uncomfortable, especially in systems that value predictability. A critical aspect of this transformation is the movement beyond emotion. Emotional experiences often serve as entry points. They can awaken awareness and generate initial momentum. However, they are inherently unstable. Without reinforcement, they dissipate. To sustain transformation, emotion must be followed by discipline. Practices must be repeated. Commitments must be maintained over time. Discipline in this context is not restrictive, it is generative. It creates the conditions under which depth can develop. Repetition reinforces patterns. Over time, these patterns become embedded, shaping both behavior and perception. Long-term commitment ensures that transformation is not episodic, but continuous. Ultimately, the restoration of the altar and the bridging of eras converge on a single principle. Sustained transformation requires both intensity and structure. One without the other is insufficient. Intensity without structure fades. Structure without intensity stagnates. When both are present, the possibility of enduring renewal emerges. The question that remains is whether individuals and communities are willing to embrace both the fire and the cost required to sustain it. With the foundations of diagnosis, historical insight, and spiritual reconstruction now established, the final movement must shift from analysis to activation. If the previous sections have clarified why spiritual fire diminishes and how it has historically been restored, this section must answer a more immediate question. What does it look like to ignite and sustain that fire within the present global church, practically, concretely, and at scale? Any credible path forward must begin at the individual level. Structural reform without personal transformation produces only superficial change. The concept of the altar, previously defined as a place of surrender, must now be operationalized within daily life. A personal altar is not symbolic, it is functional. It is a deliberate, recurring space where attention is withdrawn from distraction and directed toward encounter. Establishing such an altar requires intentionality, not spontaneity. It must be built into the rhythm of life, not appended to it. At its core, this involves the disciplined practice of deep prayer. Unlike brief or perfunctory expressions, deep prayer is characterized by duration, focus, and honesty. It resists the impulse to rush and instead creates space for internal alignment. Silence plays a critical role here. In a world defined by noise, silence is not absence, it is resistance. It allows for the recalibration of perception and the reactivation of spiritual sensitivity. Without silence, depth remains inaccessible. Closely connected to both prayer and silence is the practice of conscious repentance. This is not a generalized acknowledgement of imperfection, but a specific and ongoing confrontation with misalignment. It requires clarity, not vagueness. When practiced consistently, it prevents the accumulation of spiritual insensitivity and maintains responsiveness. Together, these disciplines form the functional architecture of the personal altar. Without them, the concept remains theoretical. However, personal practice alone is insufficient to produce sustained transformation. The second level of implementation must occur within community. Historically, awakening has always been reinforced through collective engagement. Small, consistent prayer groups represent one of the most effective mechanisms for this reinforcement. Their strength lies not in scale but in continuity. Regular gathering, without excessive structure, creates an environment where presence can take precedence over programming. This distinction is critical. Modern systems often default to programmatic solutions, structured events, scheduled content, and predefined outcomes. While these can be useful, they can also constrain responsiveness. A presence-centered model, by contrast, prioritizes attentiveness over efficiency. It allows space for unpredictability, which is often where depth emerges. In such environments, participation is not limited to observation. It becomes shared responsibility. At the leadership level, this shift requires a reorientation of control. Effective leadership in this context does not mean the elimination of structure, but the recalibration of its function. Leaders must learn to create frameworks that support spontaneity rather than suppress it. This involves discernment, knowing when to guide and when to yield. Overmanagement can extinguish emerging momentum, while under-engagement can lead to fragmentation. The goal is not control, but cultivation. Encouraging guided spontaneity may appear paradoxical, but it reflects a necessary balance. Completely unstructured environments risk instability, while overly controlled ones prevent genuine movement. Leaders must therefore act as facilitators rather than directors, creating conditions in which engagement can deepen without dictating its exact form. This requires both humility and restraint. When these three levels, personal, communal, and leadership, begin to align, a new dynamic emerges: multiplication. Transformation, when authentic, does not remain isolated. It expands organically. One individual, consistently engaging at the level of the altar, influences a small group. That group, if sustained, begins to shape a broader community. Over time, this process can extend beyond its initial context. It is important to note that this expansion does not follow conventional strategic models. Revival does not spread primarily through planning, but through transmission. It is carried by individuals whose lives have been altered in observable ways. This is why the metaphor of fire remains appropriate. Fire spreads not by instruction, but by contact. Where there is no heat, there is nothing to transmit. This leads to a broader implication. The restoration of the altar has consequences beyond the church itself. When priorities shift at the individual level, they inevitably affect relational structures. Families begin to reorganize around different values. Time is allocated differently. Conversations change. As these shifts accumulate, they begin to influence communal norms. From there, the impact extends into institutional life. Churches that prioritize presence over performance begin to model alternative forms of gathering. These, in turn, can influence wider cultural expectations. Over time, even societal structures, often perceived as resistant to change, can be affected, not through direct confrontation, but through cumulative transformation. The sequence is both simple and demanding, individual to family to church to society. Each level reinforces the next. When the altar is restored at the base, the entire structure becomes capable of realignment. Values are redefined, priorities are reordered. Culture, which is ultimately the aggregation of repeated behaviors, begins to shift. However, none of this occurs automatically. It requires decision. And this brings the discussion to its final and most direct point: the necessity of response. Analysis, no matter how precise, cannot substitute for action. The question is no longer theoretical. It is immediate and personal. Will the reader remain in the position of observer, engaged intellectually, but unchanged functionally? Or will there be a transition into initiation? This is not a question that can be deferred indefinitely. Delay, in this context, is itself a decision. Every moment of inaction reinforces existing patterns. The required shift is not dramatic in appearance, but it is significant in implication. It involves moving from listening to doing, from consuming to contributing, from evaluating to participating. It requires a redefinition of identity. One is no longer positioned as an audience member, but as a catalyst. A catalyst does not wait for ideal conditions. It initiates process. It introduces change into stable systems. This role carries responsibility, but also potential. The scale of impact is not determined at the outset. It emerges over time through consistency. The final statement, then, must be both clear and uncompromising. Revival does not begin with crowds. It begins with a single point of surrender. One life aligned, one altar restored, one decision enacted. These are not symbolic gestures. They are functional starting points. Everything that follows, whether expansion or stagnation, traces back to that initial response. If this message has challenged your assumptions, clarified your thinking, or exposed areas that require action, do not allow it to remain abstract. Continue engaging with content that pushes beyond surface-level understanding. Consider subscribing and following the channel to remain connected to the further explorations. These are not designed merely to inform, but to provoke meaningful transformation. The next step is not to watch more, it is to begin.